Hi everybody, my name is Buitink and I have the pleasure today to talk to George Papaconstantinou. George is an author, he is also a part-time professor at the School of Transnational Governance and European University, but he's mostly known of course for being the Greek Minister of Finance between 2009 and 2011, signing the first bailout deal and also imposing austerity. George, welcome.
Good to be here.
We are going to talk about Greece, about Europe. First, let's reflect a little bit on what happened in the past and then we look to the future. You wrote in your book Game Over that you were a persona non grata in Greece. 10 years down the line, are you still considering yourself to be a persona non grata if you're in Greece?
10 years is a long period, of course, and in the heat of the crisis there was a lot of anger and resentment for having taken difficult decisions which saved Greece from bankruptcy, but which imposed a lot of pain and suffering on people. But as years go by, people look at this in a more balanced manner. They see that a radical left-wing government, Syriza, for example, imposed the same kind of austerity that a socialist government did, us, or a center-right government did. So I think that the anger has given place to a more balanced understanding of this, and therefore the various personalities in the whole crisis, myself, Prime Minister Papandreou in the beginning, get a second look, let's put it that way.
Right. Okay.
But that does not mean I'm going back into politics.
No, I can imagine. You're focusing now on your being a professor, also writing books. Perhaps we can also talk a bit at the end if you at some point want to return to politics, but let's save that for later. One of the main arguments that people levy against you is that you should have arranged debt restructuring from the start. So with the first bailout deal, already some debt restructuring should have been part of it. How do you respond to that criticism?
There's a great American expression which is Monday morning quarterbacks. It's very easy to say this after the fact. The reality of 2010 is that nobody wanted debt restructuring. The European institutions flatly rejected it. The European Central Bank was threatening to basically pull the plug on the Greek banking system. Greek banks had a huge amount, about 40 billion worth of Greek government bonds. So if there was a debt restructuring, they would be completely wiped out. So a unilateral debt restructuring was out of the question because the banks would be bankrupt and the economy with it. The only way that you could have a debt restructuring would be an agreed debt restructuring with your creditors. And for that you needed a mediator, which would have been the EU institutions and the IMF, who would then fund you to get over the period when you would be out of markets. And there, of course, there was flat rejection. So that was impossible. It would have been good to have an earlier debt restructuring than when we had it in 2012. We lost 2 years, but at 2010 to have had that restructuring with the first bailout, when Greece had not proved that it could reduce the deficit, it's just fantasy.
Yeah, because for the viewers to remember, when you started your reign as a Minister of Finance,
there is no reign, I can assure you.
Your period, your brief stint as a Minister of Finance, the deficit eventually turned out to be much higher than was presented by the previous administration.
The deficit was 16%, close to 16% of GDP.
And how much was it when you, how much you thought it was when you started as your...
6. 6. So the outgoing government was saying 6, and we came in. We initially thought it was 12, and then once Eurostat started digging and finding corpses in the closets, it turned out to be over 15%, of which over 10% was primary deficit. So, you know, assuming, even if you forgave all the debt, you would still have to deal with 11% of GDP, which was your primary deficit. So you would have to somehow, from somewhere, with markets completely closed to you, find money to pay salaries, pensions, hospitals, police, and run the state.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that people see with the fact that the debt restructuring only took place in 2012 was that especially the German and the French banks got off the hook because most of the bailout money actually went to paying off German and French bank, I believe like more than 90% of the money was used for that purpose.
Not that high, but a high percentage. Yeah. I think that's true. I mean,
so in the end, it was not really a Greek bailout, but more like a bailout of the German and French banks.
Well, I think this is, you have to be careful with that argument. It is true that a lot of the bailout money went to repay the banks. But of course, even when you borrow in international markets, you borrow to repay your old debts. So there's no big difference there. Even if we had continued to borrow international market, we would still be paying out the French and German banks, right? This time, of course, it was taxpayers' money. But to say this is a fact, but to then say that the reason why the bailout happened the way it did was to bail out the banks, I think that's a stretch, because there was an easier way to bail out the banks, which is to help them directly, like we did before the Greek bailout with the big financial crisis a couple of years earlier. There were huge banking bailouts, so we could have continued in Europe the same thing. If Greece had fallen at that particular time, it would have been the whole euro that would have been at stake. And that's what was driving the attempt to go through a bailout for Greece, with all the difficulties and the problems that entailed.
Yeah, because especially Trichet was very much against banks feeling any pain.
Yes, we remember in Ireland, for example, the letter they had sent at that point to the Irish government, refusing any kind of bail-in. Bail-in came into the picture much later, as you know. In 2013 in the Cypriot crisis, and even then it didn't come in the right way, I think, but anyway. And debt restructuring for Greece happened in 2012-13, and still debt is not exactly sustainable today.
No, it's 180% or so.
It's 180%.
GDP.
Its structure is such that there is no immediate danger. In other words, over the next 5-10 years, there is no real issue of sustainability, because repayments are low, and the interest rates, of course, very, very low. The interest as a percent of GDP is low.
What's the average interest rate on the Greek bonds at the moment?
It's less than 2% or something. So, you know, you don't have an immediate end. But of course, if you project into the future, you come to problems, because the repayments go up as a percentage of GDP. So I think everybody realizes that further down the road, you need to have additional debt restructuring. And this time it's got to be on the official debt, not on the market, not on the private debt, which makes it more sensitive.
Yeah, would that be a task for, let's say, the Paris Club? The Paris Club, of course, normally takes care of sovereign debt restructuring. Is it something for them?
I wouldn't think that the Paris Club would be involved. It would be under Paris Club kind of rules, perhaps. But I think that the creditors, who are, of course, it's mostly ESM now, European Stability Mechanism, as well as the ECB, which holds a lot of bonds. The ECB will not get the haircut, of course, but the other bonds would. And there, I think the idea would be to keep it within those institutions. I don't think a nominal haircut will ever be possible politically. I think that what you would go is for a reduction in NPV terms, so extending, reducing.
Even more so than has already been done in the past.
Yes, even more so. Even more so because, I mean, if you look at any analysis, the IMF, for example, or any academic analysis, any serious academic analysis, nobody claims that under reasonable assumptions, over the long term, not immediately, but over the long term, the debt is sustainable. Everybody thinks that there will have to be additional elements. And of course, the European Council has decided to come back and revisit this. They couldn't decide on upfront debt reduction, because politically they couldn't get there. A number of countries, Germany, the Netherlands, objected very violently to this, but they have agreed to come back and look at it.
But Lagarde, she is going to head the ECB. She was very much in favor of debt restructuring. You know her personally, you're still in touch with her. Do you, like, on one end you say ECB cannot write off Greek debt, but the ECB is going to be headed by someone who's actually in favor of writing down debt. So why would it not be possible then for the ECB under her leadership to actually take that step?
I think there's a question of whether institutions such as the ECB or the IMF which have rules that apply to all situations, agree or not, for example, on having nominal reductions on the debt. I mean, the IMF, for example, excluded itself from the debt restructuring in 2012, 2013. And it did so because if its own bonds had been, the bonds that it had bought, the loans that it had made, if those were involved in the PSI that happened then, that would then have repercussions on other loans elsewhere. So I think the same argument will apply for the ECB. We'll see, because we are in a new territory here. This is no longer private sector debt restructuring. This is official sector debt restructuring. And it will have to be done with a way that is politically feasible. At the same time, taxpayers feel that they are not going, being taken for a ride, but which does allow the Greek economy to be sustainable in the long run and have a hope of growing again.
But taxpayers now are being a bit fooled, right? Because a nominal haircut they would not accept, but now they are, without realizing, being confronted with a haircut anyway, at least in net present value terms, because the maturities are extended, interest rates are low.
Of course, I mean,
so the voters, they still feel that Greece owes a debt, but at the same time, it's just Dijsselbloem told me that Greece has a lower debt service ratio at the moment than, for example, Belgium, because the maturities are long and the interest rates are so low.
That is correct, and this has been the difficulty in many countries. In agreeing for an upfront, because that servicing at the moment is lower than in many other countries. But look, all these issues are at the cusp between economics and politics. Economics may tell you that this is the best decision, but then politically some of these things may just not be doable. And yes, I mean, you can call it deceit. It is true that effectively, from an economist point of view, a nominal haircut or an LPV haircut have the same equivalence in terms of the structure of the debt in the long term.
But politically, it's different.
Politically, it's completely different to say, no, there is a normal debt restructuring. It would be good if there were. I mean, there's no question about it. That would be the cleanest way. But having been on both sides of the argument as a more academic economist and as a politician, I understand that what the theoretical models say and predict and wish sometimes when it gets to the table of the Eurogroup or the European Council just won't pass muster.
Yeah, that's clear. We see currently a lot of sovereign bonds with negative yields. I think most of the Eurozone is actually enjoying that, or at least the countries issuing those bonds, like Holland, for example. Greece yields are also getting lower every day. Do you expect Greece paper to also yield negatively anytime soon?
I don't think we'll get there, but the fact that 10-year GGBs at the moment are under 2% is pretty incredible. Thinking of, and it does not only have to do with the fact that you have a new government, which is seen more positively by foreign investors. That's part of it. It is in the context of the broader drop in yields everywhere. So
investors are looking for yields.
Investors are looking for yields, and I just hope that they're not blind to the real underlying problems as they were back in 2009. Because remember, in 2009, the spread between the Greek bond and the German Bund on the 10-year was like 20 basis points, 0.2%. So, and at that time we knew that debt, perhaps we did not know the full extent of the deficit, but we knew what debt was. Debt was very high already. Yeah. So, it
was like 130% already back in the day.
Yeah, it was 130% already.
GDP.
Yeah.
But back then the credit rating agencies, they were giving positive advice on Greece, but now at the moment Greece is not yet investment grade by the credit agencies. That is a prerequisite for the ECB to start buying Greek bonds again, either in the current repurchasing program or maybe in a future QE. Do you expect a new QE to take place in the European Union and eventually also Greece to be part of it?
The answer to the first part of the question is yes. The answer to the second one is I'm not so sure, because there was a recent decision by one of the credit ratings to keep the outlook stable and not upgrade. I think we are in an upgrade kind of trajectory, clearly, but whether we get to investment grade anytime soon is a different story. Yeah. I think it will happen, but whether it happens in the next 12 months or 18 months or further, a lot will depend. And look, because if you look at the situation of the Greek economy at the moment, you have gone through this tremendous pain and a loss of 25% of GDP from 2008 to now. The economy is growing. It's not growing fantastically fast. It is not growing the way you would have expected an economy to grow after this kind of hit. Partly this is because Syriza never convinced people about its willingness to do the kind of things to make the economy grow. There is now a change, there's a bit of a blip because of the change to a new government which is more investment friendly, and therefore there is a sense, at least from abroad, and a confidence at home that things will go a bit better.
But New Democracy is now in charge again. And
yes.
They used to be in charge before you assumed your position as a minister, and they were lying about the government statistics. They had no budgets. It was complete lack of transparency. You inherited a department without any information about future planning or a proper deficit figure. How can, for me as a foreigner, it's difficult to understand why both the Greeks and also investors abroad now fully trust the same party that actually led to so much misery in the past.
Indeed. In 2009, we took over from them and they left the mess behind. Of course, there were longer problems, structural over decades, but the mess that we inherited was the mess of the last 4 or 5 years, and it was them. They opposed the bailout. They gave birth to the populist reaction by saying that there were easy solutions. You know, you could go to zero deficit within 2 years with no pain. Nobody would get hurt, which was complete fantasy. And but then, when they were in power in 2012, 2014, 2015, they adopted the same policy as before. So yes, you make a very interesting point here, which is, are we back to 2009? New Democracy. The situation at the moment is the New Democracy is a new leader who is more liberal and open-minded than most of his party, and a party which is to a large extent unreconstructed. So investors and Greek population are looking at the new leader and what he's proposing and what he's projecting, which is more positive. The result of the election was as much as a vote of confidence to the new leader, as much as a vote of no confidence to Syriza. So people wanted Syriza to go away.
But they kept a lot of votes.
They kept. It was 31%, which as a second party, which is pretty amazing after 4 years and 4 very difficult years. But they gave a vote of confidence to New Democracy and to its new leader. We will see whether he delivers. But
so maybe same name but different animal then. Other people, other
one
ideas.
would hope. Look, unfortunately, there is no middle ground at the moment in Greece. The centre left, of which I was part, is polling in single digits. It's the same as social democracy in other parts of Europe, and so the fight was between a radical left party, which kind of became more reasonable while in power, but still is blamed, rightly so, for almost costing Greece its position in the euro during the first 6 months of 2015 and the referendum and all that, and which has not been able to deliver on its promises, and which has adopted some of the old clientelist behavior of past governments, friends and relatives, appointments and all that, and the old people, the people that we knew, but who come with a new face. So people chose those. We'll see how they can do.
And were any people or politicians or bureaucrats from the period 2004-2009, were they ever tried or were they eventually sent to jail for misrepresenting the truth, for not basically lying about the statistics?
No, in fact, the opposite. The person who was brought in by myself actually in 2010 to clean up the statistics. A Greek who at the time was working at the IMF, who came back to Greece for this, has been hounded by the Greek courts, Andreas Georgiou, for many years. He's only now finally been cleared of supposedly having inflated the deficit as opposed to having told the truth. So there is this fundamental problem here, which is that to cover up its past, there is a chunk of new democracy which is not coming clean about what really happened.
Yeah.
And nobody from that period has been prosecuted. In fact, the finance minister that preceded me has been appointed by the new government to head a public company. So, you know,
that's clientelism again. There.
You have a new government with two faces: a very modern reformist, saying all the right things, and you know, promising to reduce taxes, which are high, promising to help the most vulnerable, being positive to foreign investment, which Greece desperately needs, and with some innovative ideas on a number of fronts. Fine. And you have the darker side, which is some appointments which go back to a past I would like to forget. So we'll see which of the two will come up in the end.
And there's no popular movement in Greece that really wants to basically do some soul searching and clean up the past and actually get people tried for their misbehavior.
I think this is the saddest thing about this crisis, which is that this crisis was in a way unavoidable. Not the whole reduction in GDP, not the whole increase in unemployment, but a part of it, even with the best policy decisions, even if we all avoided mistakes, because we all made mistakes, you, us, everyone, a big part of the crisis was unavoidable. The question is, at the end of this crisis, after you have fixed the fiscal, after you have reversed the competitiveness deficit to a large extent, after you've made a lot of structural reforms, can you say that you've changed the institutions and the political culture of the country? And the answer is a very hesitant, not quite. And have we learned the lessons in terms of what we should do to avoid getting back there? In some aspects, yes. In some aspects, no. So that's my biggest worry as we come out of this. It is that the kind of soul-searching which says, yes, you know, this is why we got into the crisis. It was not just the foreigners wanting to come in and buy out Greece. It was also our own mistakes. And our own mistakes having to do with clientelism and politicians caring only about themselves. Have we really learned this to move ahead? And there I have big doubts.
Yeah. Because you were, of course, tried in court. There must have been a very dramatic period in your life. In the end, it was about a famous list sent by the French, by Lagarde, was called the Lagarde list, that had a lot of Greek tax evaders on it, and you were supposedly tampering with that list, and that's why you were tried in court. Yeah. In the end, you were not completely exonerated. You were accused, at least for tampering the fell, I think. Is that something that would prohibit you from being active in politics again in Greece?
That's not the reason why I would not want to be. I'm not interested in being in politics anymore. I mean, this was a very hard period for me. This was a trial with very strong political elements. I happened to be the most vulnerable person in this, having done the right thing and not having done any tampering, but being the perfect scapegoat for a whole political system, and therefore ending up with a political decision which exonerated him from most, but needed something so not, you know, not actually allow me to say, see, I was right all along. So this was a very, you learn out of all these experiences. I have moved on, I'm doing other things, so not wanting to go back into politics is not because of that so much. It is because I don't think that politics is a lifelong thing. Once you get in, you never get out. I think you move on, you do other things. I was fortunate and at the same time very unlucky to be in one of the most interesting politically periods of Greece and of Europe.
You had the toughest job in Europe.
I had a very tough job, and I signed the biggest bailout ever, putting your signature to the 110 billion euro. I still think it was the right thing to do, despite the mistakes on the structure of the program, the timing, the interest rates and all that. I think there was no other solution at that point. But you know, there's new generations that come, you know, nobody's irreplaceable. And the truth is that those of us that were sort of in that period, we may want some kind of recognition of, you know, we may want the whole negative attitude to change, which is fine and understandable on a human level. But we are part of this crisis, you know, and we are now coming to a post-crisis period, and other people can just take over.
That's interesting. You said post-crisis. So you're saying that at the moment Greece is not feeling, of course there's individual situations, but in general, would you say that Greece is not feeling anymore that they're still in crisis, or is it difficult to say?
Look, you can't say you're post-crisis when your unemployment is still double digits. And
but you use the words post-crisis.
Yes, you cannot say that you are completely post-crisis. You are post-bailout. And you are no longer in the crisis proper. You haven't yet been able to say, I have left the crisis behind me, because this is something that will still haunt us for many, many years. Yeah. But we're certainly not where we were in 2011, 2012. We're not in where we were in 2015. I mean, the country has moved on, and people feel that. I mean, even there is a sense. Remember, almost 500,000 Greeks have left the country. So this has been a
brain drain.
Yes, a brain drain, which has been a savior and a problem at the same time. Has been a savior because these people, young, educated, you know, would be unemployed elsewhere otherwise, and now have careers and hopefully will come back to Greece. Yeah. Okay, but it's a problem because you're losing some of your best people. You're losing the IT people, the engineers, the doctors,
the people that can rebuild the country.
Exactly. So. The country has moved on. Those of us who still live in Greece, because I still live in Greece, I mean I work abroad but I live in Greece, see a change, an optimism coming back, but nobody feels secure yet. I mean, nobody feels that the country is on a real solid footing. And there is a fear, you know, if the EU goes into recession. I mean, the EU is in its 6th, 7th year of expansion.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, this is coming to an end. So if you come back into a crisis, Greece will be vulnerable. It does not mean that you have to have another bailout, but it will certainly be vulnerable. So
recovery has been very fragile then, to a certain, because if, like you say, if there's a recession coming, and if you look at the state of the Greek banks, most of the banks have a big problem with non-performing loans, or close to 50% of the loans are non-performing. Right. What would happen if a recession hits Greece again? What would happen with the banks?
Well, this is why, you know, I blame Syriza for wasting some years, because 2014, when Syriza came in 2015, we were just growing again. 2014, Greece grew by tiny, and we had a primary surplus and the fiscal accounts as well. And then we went through the referendum, 2 years of, and now again we started growing. So we missed a period of easy money and expansion for the whole of the EU because of Syriza's policies. Okay, it's in the past. What happens now? Greek banks have reduced the level of NPLs compared with what it was. It was over 50%, now it's less than 50%, but it's still very, very high. So yes, they are vulnerable to an extent.
And there are 4 big banks in Greece.
There are 4 big banks. This is why the issue of another recapitalization has not completely left the agenda. Again, we've missed opportunities of being more radical with NPLs, writing down, writing off, selling, because there was a fear of what that would do to the
capital of the bank.
To the capital of the banks. We are where we are. A decision has been made de facto for a more gradual way out of NPLs, but which is contingent on growth. And that's the problem. If you go into a recession, or if consumers and businesses suddenly their expectations change and go from positive to negative, your NPL stock will go up rather rapidly, and you are already at a high level. So that's a real worry.
Yeah, I can imagine. Are there still Greek political parties that advocate for a Grexit to leave the Eurozone? No,
nobody.
Not even the communists or the Golden Dawn, if they.
Well, look, the communists have always in theory been in Greece being outside the EU, NATO, and of course the Eurozone. In practice, they would like to say this, but not, in opposition. Golden Dawn is out of parliament. This was the best news of this election, that the neo-Nazis were out. They didn't manage to clear 3%. Of the remaining parties, nobody is openly advocating for a withdrawal from the euro. And even though Greeks blame the EU for a lot, they are attached to the EU and they are attached to the euro because they feel the safety of, perhaps it's not love, but it is the fear of separation.
It's almost a Stockholm syndrome.
I wouldn't say that, because there are two arguments here. I mean, you can have, to my mind, leaving the euro now would be an unmitigated disaster. It's a more interesting conversation to ask whether Greece was ready to entering the euro when it did.
I think everyone agrees no.
It was not. Was it a good idea for Greece to enter or not? I think that's an interesting conversation. I would have liked Greece to do different things when it entered, but Greece's monetary and economic history with flexible exchange rates is not one of Greek successes. It is one of huge interest rates, of
a lot of inflation,
using the degrees of freedom to run the economy to the ground. So I think that coming into the common currency, certainly the period to be prepared to come in, helped Greece sort of come to a more responsible economic policy. Now, unfortunately, once we got in, we didn't pursue, especially on the structural front.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about the future of the Eurozone. So we already then discussed that within Greece there's not a lot of appetite to leave the euro. Now we see in Greece, of course, in Italy, a lot of political unrest with Salvini trying to have new elections. In the polls, he's 40%, I think around 40% people that want to vote for him. He's, of course, quite anti-euro, anti-eurozone, but depends a bit on his mood, I guess, depends a bit on how much pushback he gets from Brussels. You're writing a book about the future of the euro, or the future of the European Union, I guess, in more broader terms, called Whatever It Takes. Of course.
Yes, I like phrases.
Yeah,
Game Over was my first book, and this one is about...
Because Game Over, who said Game Over?
It was Jean-Claude Juncker, when the statistics fraud was discovered in 2009, when we came in. He said, the game is over, we need serious statistics.
Yeah, and of course Draghi said Whatever It Takes in 2012.
The pivotal phrase, that it was the turning point of the euro crisis.
So what's your book about? Could you summarize what the main takeaways?
I think that phrase was used in a particular instance, and it helped a lot to convince the markets that the ECB was behind the whole effort of keeping the euro together. But I think it is a symbol of something broader, which is, are we going to do whatever it takes to keep the European construction going against the people who would like it to collapse? And those people are, are the populists. They are people from outside. The US administration, for example, the current one, would like a weaker Europe. So it's not only about the EMU. It's not only about the Eurozone doing the kind of necessary reforms, even though I talk a lot about that, because I think that we need a European safe asset. We need a stabilization tool. We need more risk-sharing mechanisms. We need the European budget. We need to go even beyond that and have a common, start going towards a common European tax base. A lot of things that in the north of Europe are just not acceptable.
Exactly.
So we need to find solutions for these things. The more we delay, the more we weaken and we open ourselves to problems in the next downturn, because the downturn is coming up.
So your book is a bit of a personal utopia then about how the
I would not say
the
it's a
European
utopia.
Union should look like.
It's a utopia for realists. Let's put it that way. There's also a book on that, which is to say, let's see what is acceptable, but let's find a negotiating space which it goes even beyond the EMU and looks at other things as well. For example, defense. You could trade off some of the German reluctance on economic matters if you give something on defense, for example. And now, I know that these kind of grand bargains need the right political environment for them, and the political environment is not there.
It's not there, especially now with problems in Italy.
That's true. But you have to think of what the alternative is. And I don't think that business as usual is a viable proposition at the moment.
And then a leaner European Union where you, as member states, you agree on certain themes. For example, you agree on a proper migration policy with collective border control, or you agree on something else. Would that not be a solution?
You mean a coalition of the willing kind of idea? Look, in part we have that already. I have reservations about institutionalizing this, saying that, okay, from now on, there is not one, because how was the European Union built until now? It was that we're all in it. Even the euro, people took a pledge that they would eventually join. Okay, some have opted out formally. But if you then extend this formally to all sorts of EU policy areas, and then say you can have a Europe a la carte, then next time that you want to tell off the Hungarians for human rights abuses, you won't be able to do it because they'll say, well, sorry, we've opted out of that. And you could say that, yes, there is a basis that we all subscribe to, and then we pick and choose. But if you make this into the formal backbone of a European Union, I think you create more problems than you solve. So I do believe that we need to make sure we keep everyone on the boat. I think it is an extremely difficult thing, and this means that we will go slower than we would have liked in certain things. And it is, sure, on certain areas, some people will forge faster than the others. But if you institutionalize a concentric circle or coalition of the willing or a club arrangement, you have problems.
In Greece, are there political parties also sharing this view about the future of Europe? PASOK or?
I think that most, well, let's say that most political parties in Greece are for more Europe. But I wouldn't necessarily say that there's been a very in-depth discussion on what that entails. I mean, it's a shame that the European Parliament elections were a mirror of national elections in a sense. And this was a problem, I think, throughout Europe. I mean, they were fought.
It's always the case.
Sorry? It's always the case. They were fought. Although we did see an increase in participation, which for me was because they were more politicized as European Parliament elections. I think that the fear of a backlash against Europe from populist forces, from Italy to Hungary to elsewhere, kind of, made people less complacent. People take for granted that what we have is there. Well, that's not the case. And there are many people who want to undo a lot of what we have. Brexit, for all the problems that it has and will generate, has acted as a glue for many European countries to stick together and to think a little bit more carefully about.
It has reduced appetite in Holland for an exit for sure. That's
and I think even in Italy, I mean, even Salvini in Italy, because you mentioned Salvini before, is backpedaling a little bit on the ideas of leaving the euro, leaving the EU. He's saying, no, that's not part of my agenda. I just want to change from within.
Yeah, but if you look at, for example, like a big problem, of course, we have is with migration. Everyone finds it, of course, horrible to see refugees floating on boats, not being able to go to a port. It's very difficult, apparently, to find a common solution there. So ordinary voters see politicians from several European countries fighting about something like migration. So it also gives me the impression, if we cannot solve those issues, how are we supposed to be a proper political union when all these interests are so different for all these different countries?
There is a question about whether, how you keep together a project where there's heterogeneity of preferences, to put it in economics terms, even though you know that the public goods that you're defending are best done by everyone at the same time. Migration is a classic case. It's not just Greece and Italy who are the first recipients. It's a European problem, and we have not been dealing with it as a European problem. But, we have to find a solution. On the migration case, we have an agreement with Turkey which kind of works. It's not a great one, but it has stopped the flow. It has given us a bit of time to We have unfortunately not been able to move forward with the solution of the quota system. Some countries took a burden upon themselves, Germany did, with a big political backlash, of course.
Yeah.
And then you have a number of countries which flatly reject the idea of migration as such. So there are no easy solutions, and they are political discussions. They are not technical discussions. It's not just about how you have an external action force. These are deeply political discussions that we keep having to have in our countries.
Yeah. Is migration, is emigration or immigration a bigger problem for Greece at the moment?
I think that economically speaking, it is the people who have left, the Greeks that have left abroad. At the moment, even though Greece has not handled its migration flows, its incoming flows well at all, I think it's really embarrassing the conditions that we have allowed these people to live in on the islands. But in terms of numbers at the moment, it is a manageable issue. Of course, if Turkey decides to open up the flow, then it's a whole story altogether. But for the future of Greece economically, the 400,000 or 500,000 people who have left the country and who are young and educated, creating the conditions for them to come back is a much more important issue than the migration.
When is your book going to be out?
The book is out in the end of October. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk once it's out.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining me. Anything else you want to mention or have said?
Oh, I think we've covered a lot of ground, yeah.
Well, thanks, George.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul.